But I remember thinking, if I had hurt Zara or hurt myself, the newspapers would have painted me as this horrible, selfish, nasty person, as opposed to somebody who was just so isolated, so alone, so confused, lost in a system that didn't know how to help and people didn't know how to help, that I would have been the villain, and rightly so, but I was so ill that now what I'm trying to do is teach people how to have those hard conversations and how not to dismiss and how not to give unsolicited advice and how to genuinely embrace people to say, how can I help?
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Leanne Butterworth is on a mission to create a world where everyone feels heard, valued, and visible. She's the founder of Empathy First and the host of the Professional Empathy podcast. She brings together her lived experience, a degree in applied science, and postgraduate qualifications in social enterprise. Leanne is an active member of the startup, mental health, and social enterprise communities, tutoring social enterprise at the Queensland University of Technology, and working with the Queensland Social Enterprise Council. With unique, memorable empathy training, she empowers leaders and communities with empathy skills that create happier, healthier, more sustainable workplaces and workforces, and save lives. In this conversation, we discuss growing up as a self-reliant, independent kid in Australia, while also learning to ask for help when she needs it. Her struggle with postpartum depression and what it taught her. Her virtual reality business, looking to foster empathy using cutting-edge technology. We also discuss what is empathy? Why is it important for personal life as well as business? How can it be taught? Her empathy commitment method. Empathy as individuals and in teams. What blocks empathy? And the relationship between empathy and design thinking, among many other topics. This conversation with Leanne is one of dozens of conversations we have lined up for you with world-changing thinkers, designers, scientists, and entrepreneurs who are changing our world for the better every day. If you're listening in a podcast app, you already know how to follow a show. So if you don't want to miss these conversations, follow us now. And now let's jump right in with Leanne Butterworth. All right. I'm sitting here with Leanne Butterworth. Leanne, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Aaron. How are you?
Good. It's a beautiful day. Like in Israel, the summer is ebbing. So it's still warm and nice outside, but it's not overly hot. So you can go for a walk or a run and not come back completely drenched.
Oh, beautiful. We're getting to the other side of that. So we're drenched first thing in the morning.
That's nice too. I like all seasons.
It's beautiful here at the moment. I'm in Australia, for those who don't know.
Yeah. I'd like to start the conversation these days asking about your COVID experience. And because it's been so long, it's almost like impossible to encapsulate. So I'd love to hear like how it went for you overall, and then maybe one crazy instance or one memorable story from your time in COVID.
So I'm in Queensland, Australia. At the moment, we have no COVID cases at all. We are COVID zero.
Wow.
So over the past, 18 months, I was running a VR business. And that's the main issue that I've had is I was running a business that used virtual reality in a mental health and empathy space. So I had to stop the VR and find a different avenue. And I did that and I created Empathy First. But other than that, we've had a couple of lockdowns where I was at home with my children. I had a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old. So we did a little bit of homeschooling. Mummy's not so good at homeschooling when she has other things to do. But at the moment, actually, life's pretty normal. We had a few really hard lockdowns. We're on tenterhooks in terms of is a case going to come across the border? Because New South Wales hasn't really got a firm grip on what's going on. So they're a little bit out of control. But we're kind of on edge going, ooh, are we going to lock down? Are we not again? Everybody's trying to get jabs, but there's probably not as many jabs as we'd like. But we're kind of sitting pretty easy at the moment. We're all going about daily life. But with this, we're going to lock down again. And we watch what's happening around the rest of the world. I mean, we have our fair share of people who aren't getting vaccinated for whatever reason they hold dear. We're expecting another lockdown at some point if a case does cross the border from one state to another. But at the moment, we're actually doing all the things. We're wearing masks and getting jabs and we're keeping our distance. But that's about it. So apart from a virtual reality business going in the toilet, we've been really lucky. We've had such solid leadership and compliance here that, the only thing we really fear at the moment is a breakthrough across the border and we all go into lockdown again. But we're trying as hard as we can to get everybody vaccinated so that doesn't happen.
Right. And this is where the benefits of being an island comes in. A lot of island nations were pretty effective. I know there's a conversation about, is this an island?
Yeah.
But
No.
just there's no close neighbors. There's no cross-border traffic.
Yeah. But that said, a lot of the cases that have come into Australia have been from overseas and they've been very strict on the 2-week hotel quarantine. But even still, Queensland is not an island. We have some very strict borders at the moment with other states. So there are people who can't cross the state borders and they do it on a case-by-case basis to let people in and they're trying to do as well as they can to make the right decisions there. But we found that the people who've come across with COVID have been truck drivers. We're sitting by ourselves at the moment. But yeah, definitely the fact that Australia is an island has made it easier, but that does mean there are a lot of Australians, thousands of Australians still trying to come home. And there's an empathy piece in there of saying they're Australian citizens. And a lot of people saying, no, don't let them in, don't let them in. Why are we letting other people in? We're like, they're still Australian citizens who are trying to get home.
That was happening in Israel too for a while. And strangely for a while, because there was an election coming and there was a selection committee deciding who can come in and not. And at the time, people were saying, wait, all of these Orthodox communities where actually COVID is pretty high, were coming in, no problem, because they supported the government. And a lot of people traveling all over the world who are maybe tend to be more liberal, were not getting approvals. And it was like, is this fair? And eventually I felt like they just let everybody in because they were like, okay, no, we can't. There's too many issues with this. This is really interesting. So to start the conversation, we have a question that I ask every guest that kind of leads us to what you do today, because we like to understand the person before we understand the project and kind of what led to the project. And so I want to ask you, what's something you learned early in life or even in childhood that still drives you today?
There's a saying that I learned like 20 years ago when I was trying to lose weight, like in my 20s, everybody does that. And I really knuckled down. And the thing that I solidified in my mind is this: if it was 10 2-letter words can change your mind, 10 2-letter words can change your life. And it was, if it is to be, it is up to me. And that's something that I've carried with me. And I realized that I've always been very self-reliant. I've always been very independent. And that comes from a lot of reasons. But the thing about that is I now use that twofold is, firstly, nobody's coming to rescue me. If I want something done, I have to do it. But I also have to unlearn that. So I'm holding it very dear to the point where I nearly got it tattooed on my arm. But I also have to unlearn it in a lot of ways, because it means that if it is to be, it is up to me. It means I don't often ask for support and I don't ask for help. So I have to balance that, because that's that childhood driver of nobody's coming to rescue me. If I want to do it, I have to do it myself. And so it's that very forthright, strong-minded, independent. But then there's that insecurity as well, that if I ask for help, it might not be there. So to me, that's an act of vulnerability, to actually ask people for help and admit that I don't know the answer. And I use that a lot in my teaching. But to me, that's holding on to something so tightly, but learning that it doesn't always serve me, and being able to ask for help and admit that I don't have the answer and get other people's opinions, and also face the fact that I could be wrong sometimes, which from childhood is like, I was the overachiever in childhood. So it was up to me, and that's where my value was, in being the smartest in the class. Whereas unlearning a lot of that sort of stuff is, to me, more where the lesson is.
Yeah, but you need to learn to hold both the thing and its opposite at the same time. My brain just went to trying to make a rhyme that completes that sentiment, kind of the other side of it. I couldn't
Exactly.
figure it out. But if it is to be, it's up to me, but I need some help and not all knowing and all capable.
Exactly. So it's almost motivation to get off your butt and do it yourself, and not wait for the answer to fall into your lap, and be okay to fail and all that sort of stuff. But it's
Mm,
also, you're not an island. There's networks around you and people who genuinely care about you and your success,
mm.
who are there for you. And to me, that in itself was an act of vulnerability, of going, oh, hang on, I don't have to do this. I can accept help. That's not a measure of failure. And that's that growth mindset that we never grew up with. It was all get the marks, do the things, no failing. Whereas this whole growth mindset that my children are learning, which is give it a crack. It's okay to fail. Everything's a learning experience. Love yourself no matter what. The fact that you tried is the gold star. And just giving stuff a crack and being creative and innovative.
Yeah.
That's a new way of thinking. We didn't learn that in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, I can see that. It's interesting. What I find is when I went to the US to live there, I felt more comfortable in the startup environment because it was more similar to just Israeli everyday culture, which
Okay.
is less hierarchical, debate, more like fast decision making, which is how I grew up. This is how people do things here. And now it definitely feels like everywhere that people are understanding that planning and having all the right answers is less and less possible these days, right?
Absolutely. And there's also pushback on people being closed minded and
Mm,
thinking that they have all the answers and thinking that their way is the right way, because we're learning every day. You meet new people every day and go, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. And in my
mm.
business, like, I'm relying on people not to be closed minded. I'm relying on people to be open minded and open to self reflection and growth and all those types of opportunities. In the 80s and 90s, that was not the discussion that was had.
When you say, if it is to be, it's up to me, you could also
Mhm.
say there's this interesting tension first between talking about yourself and then talking about another person, right? When
Mhm.
you talk about another person, it could be unempathetic sometimes to say, well, if you're in trouble, that's your problem. It's up to you. At the same time, it could also be very kind to be challenging to someone who needs the challenge, to
Mhm.
say, it is up to you, like to go and do it. And knowing that balance and staying true to, I guess, both reality and the person and what's good for the person in front of you with this responsibility mindset is something that I'm still struggling with.
Yeah. And it also comes back to what you can and can't control. I can't control everything. I'd like to, but I can't control everything. And it's letting that go and that being okay, and getting out of that pass or fail mindset. Because the other thing is, if you pull it apart a lot and sort of look at it from a lot of different angles, there's so much that you could pull out of that. And it's when I was losing weight, it was what I really gripped onto, because
Mm,
I had to make the decisions. Nobody was making the decisions for me. So in that bubble, it was fine. But really, you could pull that apart and use it in all different contexts and go, it's actually steeped in privilege.
mm.
It's actually steeped in isolation. But that to me is what bubbles up for me to be motivated to make the choice, get off my butt, do the things, do what needs doing. But yeah, you could pull it apart and get very interesting with it.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to get back to your early life. And you said you studied exercise physiology, you were studying applied science. So what led you in that direction? And then when did you decide to change course?
Yeah. So my passion at high school was volleyball. I was a volleyball nerd. I loved it. I still play. I took 20 years off and I've come back in the last year. I don't hit as hard as I used to. But my passion at high school was volleyball. And when I graduated high school, it was in the mid 90s. I graduated 94, and it was very much go to university and do something. There wasn't a lot of depth in it, the advice that was given to us. It was just go to university, everything else will work out for itself. And I love volleyball. I loved exercise physiology. I loved coaching. And I went overseas and lived in Canada for a year as an exchange student and really solidified, played a lot of volleyball over there. And that really solidified for me my love of sport. And I wanted to understand it deeper. And so I came back and did an applied science degree in exercise physiology and learned anatomy and biomechanics and all those sorts of skills and lots of critical thinking skills and research skills and psychology and all sorts of things. And I loved it. And at one point I wanted to do sports medicine, but a couple of doors closed, just life got in the way. And what happened was I worked as an exercise physiologist for a few years and then got into management, in hospital management, and worked with exercise physiologists. So I wasn't actually doing the things, I was managing and project managing exercise physiologists and physiotherapists. And that's sort of where my trajectory took me. It was more into that administration management pathway. And I loved it because all of the skills that I used. So I never went back to actually being an exercise physiologist as much as I loved it. It's always been part of my life. But I went more into the project management side, but used all of those skills. And I found that a lot of the skills that I learned, a lot of the information that I've learned has helped me to be a critical thinker and not take things at face value and ask more questions. So then I went back to university in 2018. So I was 40 when I went back to university, and I was terrified because I hadn't been to universities. I graduated 1999. And the world and university is a very different place. We were still photocopying things and going to lectures, and there was no internet research. And so I went back and I studied nonprofit philanthropy and social enterprise at university in 2018. And again, I thrived. I went, oh, I've missed university so much. And yeah, just went full nerd and topped the class and, did all the nerdy things that you do. But because I was so immersed in it and I so loved the social enterprise space, I've heard some people go, oh, you have a degree, but it's a waste that you're not using it. Going, no way. I learned so much. And I use those skills all the time.
Yeah, I feel the same about my supposedly useless history degree. I use it all the time to understand the world around me and everything I do. And it's interesting. I also did a master's degree in my late 30s, early 40s, and I just finished. And there's a difference between studying as a young person to studying as a more mature person. Nobody's making you do it. You don't have to do it. For me, it was a completely different experience.
But also there's context when you go back, because you think, oh, I could use this and I can use it now. And I can write assignments based on what I know and what I need to know. And I can see gaps in my knowledge. And whereas I teach undergrads at the moment, I teach them social enterprise. And there's that real mindset. And we had it back in the day of, well, I might or I might not use this. It's nice to know. It's interesting. I don't really care. It's not like a dentist learning to give fillings. Like they have to know that. This is I might use that one day.
Yeah.
And there's not that urgency or context to what they're learning. And so I'm trying to instill in my students, hang on, the stuff I'm trying to teach you here in social enterprise is going to serve you. Learning to look at business through an empathetic lens, through an environmental lens, through a problem-solving lens will serve you down the track in whatever career you choose. But it's trying to get that relevance, that context piece, that personal connection to the content that I think we get later on, because we go, oh, I've seen how that unfolds. I've seen what happens if you get that wrong. I've seen the consequences of poor coaching or poor business or whatever it is. So we have that context later on. So yeah, I loved it. And now they've adopted me and now I teach.
It almost feels like we maybe should reverse this assumption, this default assumption that we have that you're done with high school and you should immediately go to college or university. Maybe just take 5 to 10 years to do something, anything.
Yeah.
And once you feel like you want to learn something, then do it. I think it will be a completely different, much more successful experience.
Oh, hugely. I mean, like I said, I had a year off in between high school and university, and it solidified that I was doing the right thing and really wanted to go back to university. But I've seen kids burn out where they go, oh, I'm just going because it's something to do, or it's because my parents want me to do it. I've heard of people who've done design degrees but aren't really into it. And you say, what are
Yeah.
you genuinely interested in? They say, I want to play music. You go, play music. There's
Yeah.
so much you can do in that space. Or ask yourself why you're doing this particular degree. Like, why do you want to learn about policing? Because I care about people. Cool, let's build on that. Because what happens is if you end up going down a path that you don't love, you'll end up somewhere that just doesn't rock your world. You go, I didn't know that that's where this path was going. That's not why I started. And there doesn't seem to be that investigation early on of what people are actually studying. I mean, if I'd mixed up my degree and mixed it with entrepreneurship is now a thing at university, it wasn't back in the day.
Right.
Then you go, oh, there you go. There's something we can play with. There's something we can really get the skills and start to combine interests. Yeah, and really figure out. If I go back and do a PhD, I'm not just going to do it for the sake of doing it. I'm going to find something in the empathy space and sink my teeth into it. I'm not just going to do it because that's a big commitment.
Yeah. We do a lot of user testing of products that we help design. And one of the most obvious things you notice is you have to work with the person's own desires and passions, or everything falls apart. Like, you put a product in front of them. If there's no driving curiosity, passion to, oh, how could this affect me? If the product is not aligned with them, there's no way for them to even get to the screen you want to show them. They just won't click anything. They'll humor you, but you can't work with it. It's almost like there's a flow of water that needs to become a river, and the water is just not there. And so, and I think it's the same with education or anything. If it's not coming from within you, it's just, you're not going to get to the end of it even.
And that's so obvious when you look at your inbox. You look at your email inbox and you get all of these newsletters and stuff and you go, oh, I don't even remember signing up for that piece of software. And clearly it didn't rock my world. Like, I'm sure that the people who designed it love it and think it's the bee's knees. And I'm sure I'm in lots of people's inboxes and they're like, oh, yeah, that was that thing, whatever. But if it doesn't resonate with you, you don't follow that path. You don't jump down that rabbit hole. But when it does, then you become the advocate for it and you go, oh my God, you need to talk to this person. You need to do this thing. But yeah, I look at my inbox and go, did I? When? What? I don't even know what that is. And I feel bad because I know there's a human on the other end sending out that email. Sorry.
So there's another milestone after your graduate school where you actually got pregnant, and that affected your direction.
Yeah. So not after graduate school. So that was before. So once upon a time, so I finished 99, worked up until about 2009, so that's about 10 years, and then decided, okay, well, this is the trajectory of my life now. This is what I'm supposed to do. So had 2 children in 2 years, and it was beautiful, like beautiful, all natural, water births, the whole deal was beautiful. But what I found was that every undealt with emotion that I'd ever had, because I never had therapy in my 20s or my teenage years, every undealt with emotion bubbled up when I had my second child, and it turned into postnatal depression. But for me, it presented very differently. It didn't present as postnatal depression, like I wasn't in bed sad. I was postnatal, what I call pissed off. I was raging. I was just this seething rage the whole time. And I remember putting a post on Facebook that said, I know there are drugs for postnatal depression, but are there drugs for postnatal pissed off? And the comment section was, just have a drink, go for a walk. These days, like, the days are long, the years are short, cherish these moments. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so I ended up feeling guilty, and it really got pretty bad. And nobody around me was like, oh, I think there's something up. It was, oh, you look amazing. And I was about 15, 20 kilos lighter than I am now. Like, I was so skinny because I wasn't eating, I wasn't keeping food down, I wasn't sleeping. But what happened was then I went to my doctor, and my second was 3. So Zara was about 3. And I said something, and she goes, sweetie, I think this is bigger than you think it is. This isn't right. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to do this by yourself. There is help. And I went, huh? And I'm like, no, people like me don't have depression. Nobody's said anything. It's fine. She said, I actually think we need some help. So I agreed to go on medication.
Mm.
And I remember going to the chemist to fill in the prescription for the first time. And the lady at the chemist said, "Have you had these before?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh, well, they can knock you around a little bit, but you're going to be fine." And I burst into tears going, "Are you sure? Am I doing?" She's like, "You're going to be fine. You're doing the right thing. Make sure you've got support and you're doing well. You're doing really, really well." So
Mm.
I was on antidepressants for about 15 months. And what they did was they rubbed out the lows, but they also rubbed out the highs. And so I was a little bit of a zombie, a sleepy zombie for about 15 months, but it got me through and I got out the other side and counseling and all that sort of stuff. What I realized, and one of the catalysts of that was then me going, oh, nobody around me had any clue. And the thing that really hit me hard was I remember Zara was about 18 months old and I was just raging. I just couldn't let this rage go. And I was so angry at her. And she's 18 months old. Like she probably drew on a wall or something or just whatever. And I just had her by the shoulders. And it was only milliseconds, but I let go and I recoiled and I put myself in timeout. So I put myself in the kitchen behind the gate and just went, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. And even still, it was another 18 months before I got help. But I remember thinking, if I had hurt Zara or hurt myself, because I used to fantasize about that, just driving off into the sunset. But if I had hurt either one of us, the newspapers would have painted me as this, how could this mother do that? This horrible, selfish, nasty person, as opposed to somebody who was just so isolated, so alone, so confused, lost in a system that didn't know how to help and people didn't know how to help, that I would have been the villain. And rightly so, but I was so ill that now what I'm trying to do is teach people how to have those hard conversations and how not to dismiss and how not to give unsolicited advice and how to genuinely embrace people to say, how can I help? Are you okay? And it's that how are you today piece and realizing that people can be struggling and look perfect on the outside.
Yeah. Actually, the more perfect you seem on the outside, the more likely it is that you're hiding something.
Oh, God, yeah. Perfectionism and
Yeah,
insecurity. What are they? Bedfellows.
for sure. Yeah, it's that experience. A lot of people, I think, who deal with empathy and who deal with any sort of well-being and helping people come at it from a place of first experiencing some kind of suffering. And I know that about myself is that I got interested in other people's suffering through my own suffering. It's not enough to just read about it in a book if you haven't experienced it. And interestingly, from that place, you're doing VR and simulations, and you found a way to combine these things.
Yeah, so what happened was, once I came out of the medication and started to get clarity and my children started to get a little bit older, I started working with a little nonprofit and I developed this virtual reality simulation with them. And it was, we need to do something for World Mental Health Day. So I developed this with them. And then as the project continued, I actually took over the project, took ownership of it and the VR and everything. And that was fun because it was all about psychosis and all about advanced mental health literacy. And I took the project to Iowa and ran like 18 workshops in 10 days for police and psychs and all that sort of stuff. A beautiful lady named Kelly who'd lost her son invited me to Iowa to run these projects. And I just thought that I was organizing these things. And what happened was, for a couple of the workshops, I got up and told my story because I said, this is what it genuinely feels like to be dismissed. This is the implications. This is what helps and what doesn't help. And in doing that, what I realized was my story actually had value in what I was doing. And it solidified the reason why I cared so much. So then as my story, and I started to learn more and go, but I know that now, then they became meshed. And it wasn't just a project I was running anymore. It became this, that was my why, is because I know what that feels like and I don't want anybody else to feel that way. So the VR kept going until COVID. But what happened was once it hit, I pulled out of it all the foundational things that I found were missing across the board. So when we run an advanced mental health workshop, people didn't know what empathy was. Even people who, like nurses, could not communicate with empathy. They could not communicate in a way that made people feel heard. So all of the fundamental stuff about what is empathy and why is it important and how do we communicate with empathy, I've put that into this empathy first, but everything is couched in what did I need in that moment? What would have helped me earlier? And now looking back, I know that I was the person who used to give advice. It used to be my favorite thing because it meant that I didn't have to feel the feelings. So I was confused about empathy. And the more research I do, the more I underpin it and go, oh, this is my story. I'm saying how I used to be and what I learned and what would have helped me and what I'm doing with my kids. And it's this journey going, well, if I am on this journey, other people need to be on this journey. Other people would feel the same way and benefit from all these things that I'm learning. And that's what I'm finding as well. But it wasn't until those two meshed and I went, oh, that's my why. That's why I care so much, because this stuff changes lives. Like empathy saves lives. There is no two ways about it. Like I know for certain if my GP had not gone, oh, sweetheart, this is bigger than you think it is. I'm here for you. Life could have taken a very different turn. And that was one act of empathy.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. And so you've outlined actually some of my next questions. We hear, and especially in the design world where I come from, we hear the word empathy thrown around quite a lot. And it's interesting, like I sometimes read debates about, is empathy important in design? And there's blog posts and tweets. So what is empathy to you? What do you think is the definition?
We do the same thing in social enterprise. We talk about human-centered design a lot. That's basically all we talk about, because if you get that piece wrong, then you're designing at people, not with people, and they're not going to want to buy your stuff. They're not going to want to participate in your programs, and you might have unintended consequences. So the first step of human-centered design is empathy, as you just said. But there are so many different definitions of empathy that the one that I use even still has 3 parts to it. So there are 3 types of empathy, and this is how I teach it. There are 3 types of empathy. Unless you're all talking about the same thing, you can be having debates using the same word, but talking about very different things. So the first type of empathy is emotional empathy, which is you're sad, I'm sad, we're all sad together, and I probably neglect my own emotional needs in the process because I've gone so deep into yours. And that's the one that a lot of people instantly think about, because when you say, I want you to be empathetic, they go, oh, I don't have the depth. I don't have the emotional capacity to take on anything else, which means that they're not practicing really good self-care boundaries, knowing what you are and are not responsible for. They're just oozing into other people's emotions and absorbing them. That isn't empathy. We cry watching movies. That's fine. It's okay. The second type is cognitive empathy. And even that's got a few different things, but cognitive empathy is that perspective taking. I can see your point of view. I know what it's like to be you. I've been there before. The trouble with that is if it's filled with assumptions, then you can actually cause distance. Or if you use it to say, if I was in your shoes, I would do this. Or if you look at someone's perspective and then judge them for it. I can see what it's like to be you, but that's not how you should think. Or if you, let's say, do a virtual reality experience and you then turn it around and go, I did this VR, I know what it's like to be you. All of these things cause disconnection. So cognitive empathy has its place and we do use it. But the third type, and the type that's really important, especially in the design space, is that compassionate empathy, the ability to share and understand the feelings of another person and respond appropriately. And if you break that one down, it's listen and connect. So it's the ability to share the feelings of another person, which means understanding your own emotional landscape so you can understand the emotions of other people.
Right.
Understanding their perspective is their truth, not judging them for it, just accepting. And then responding appropriately is not dismissing, not giving unsolicited advice, not fixing, not going into helper mode, not comparing, not saying at least, not telling them what they should just do. So once you get that definition and hold on to that definition of the ability to share and understand the feelings of another person and respond appropriately, then when you look at a design perspective, then we go, who are we listening to in our design? Right. And it's not only listening to your market or your beneficiary or your user, it's listening to your team and yourself. Because empathy has those three directions. It's for yourself, because the only way you can be fully present with somebody is to already have been fully present with yourself and take care of yourself and your own emotional health. For your colleagues and your team so that they trust you and it's safe and they're all working at their best and they feel safe to be creative and innovative and get things wrong and not be judged and show up as their whole self so that you can work as a team. And for, let's say, the user, you actually listen to their feelings, listen to their experiences, listen to their wants and their needs and design with people as opposed to at people or for people, which means you're then going to get a much better design outcome because the whole team is on the same page. Whereas if you've got somebody who's saying emotional empathy and another person talking about cognitive empathy and you don't even know that they're talking two different languages, you are never going to be able to move past square one because this person's going, I don't have the strength to be empathetic. So empathy doesn't belong in design because we'll all burn out. You've got someone else going, but I know what it's like to be them. And the third person going, can we all just listen for a second?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not until you have that shared language that you can actually move forward and flourish as a design team until you actually know what you're all talking about. You're all on the same page. You're all safe. You all trust. You all know what the outcomes are supposed to be. And that's designing something with a human in mind. And then you go down the human-centered design path of realizing humans are flawed. Humans are going to take shortcuts. Humans have particular needs. They have particular wants. They are not robots.
Right.
And then you move forward and go, okay, who are we listening to? So rather than going, who do we need to speak to? Who do we need to listen to? Who are our users? Who are our stakeholders?
I'm hearing in your three definitions, which I love, three different levels of engagement with the system or landscape of another person. So where one is so afraid of the emotional tax that you're going to pay that they stay outside, they don't even engage. I actually thought that would be someone who's afraid of the emotional empathy. If their definition is, it always has to be this experiencing what another person's doing. Yeah. I don't want to do it, so they stay out.
Yeah, absolutely. And what they tend to do is then intellectualize any type of emotion. So you tell me a problem and I will intellectualize it, which means I will tell you what the answer is. I'll tell you what you need to do so to make the emotion go away instead of acknowledging the emotion in a detached way.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. The person who does engage, that's the cognitive empathy. They engage, but they don't fully respect the space that they're engaging with, right? So it's almost like I engage in order to understand and then tell you who you are and what you need and claiming that I now fully understand what I'm seeing, right? And then it seems like just a proper respect for complexity and humanity of another person would lead you to the third type.
Yeah, because the thing that cognitive empathy can sometimes miss is that acknowledgement of the impact of your own words and actions.
Right.
That we can't hear your intention. We hear your words and actions. And people don't own. They go, well, that's just my opinion or I'm just being honest. No. That has an impact. You have to self-reflect. So the thing about cognitive quite often is people will think empathy is about learning about other people. It's actually not. It's actually learning about yourself. And the more you learn about yourself, the more you can connect with other people. But they go, I'll learn about what it's like to be a refugee or no. you need to identify the vulnerability in yourself so that you can identify and be okay with the vulnerability and emotions in others.
Yeah. Talk more about that. Why do you need to understand yourself before you can understand the other? What does it have to involve the self? And if it doesn't, why does it feel wrong?
Yeah. So that one, especially in some for-purpose businesses, like some social enterprises, you'll see people who create distance and they come in with almost this white savior mode. They want to help the people, but they don't in turn see the humanity of the people. You'll hear words like deal with, manage these people. And so what
Right.
they haven't done is really look at the humanity. They look at people as problems to be solved, not humans to be heard. So when you get into that mindset, that can be really toxic because then you look at people as problems to be solved. So that's where your mind goes. Now, that would have a reason as to how you've come to that conclusion. So if you believe and you have false beliefs about emotions, let's say, and you think that feelings don't belong at work, emotion is a sign of weakness, then that comes from somewhere. And the only way you're going to learn about that is to look inwards and say, well, why do I think that emotion is a sign of weakness? Why do I think feelings don't belong at work? Why am I afraid to be vulnerable? Why do I put profit over people? And it's asking those questions. And so when we look at something like judgment, I tell people judgment and empathy cannot coexist. You have to choose. You're either going to judge someone or you're going to empathize and get that bit right. But a lot of people are judgmental because they judge themselves harshly, and that comes from insecurity.
Yeah.
So in order to let go of a lot of judgment of other people and comparison, and you should be doing this, you need to look inwards to say, well, why do I compare? Who am I comparing to? Why do I think I'm better than or worse than another human? And it's a lot of times that insecurity, because that's what we latch on to when we're feeling insecure, is then comparison or putting other people down or telling somebody else they're an idiot, as opposed to really going, well, hang on. Their opinion doesn't affect my version of myself, and my version of myself doesn't affect them. But I can look at that human being as a human being with all their flaws and their perspectives and their truths and their experiences and make that person feel heard, because at everybody's absolute fundamental core, they want to be heard, valued, and visible. I'm not asking you to feel their feelings. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to listen to that person and take away your assumptions, your expectations, and your judgment of that person. And in order to do that, you need to look inwards as to why you assume things about other people, why you don't have uncomfortable conversations, why you have false beliefs about emotions, why you do judge other people. So a lot of empathy and empathy training is not me adding to your burden. I'm not teaching you stuff necessarily. I'm inviting you to unlearn things that do not serve you and serve those around you by getting you to be brave, because vulnerability takes bravery, because you don't know what the other side of it is. If somebody tells you something, you need to be brave in order to go, thank you so much for telling me that. I've no idea how to respond to that, but let's figure it out. Is a whole lot more vulnerable than me just going, oh, you should just go talk to the counselor. But that's where we go, because we are insecure, because we don't know the right answer, because we're uncomfortable with the unknown. And it has nothing to do with that person, and you've just made them feel worse.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, let's say in the perspective of someone who's grieving, if you're uncomfortable with grief or death or loss, you're going to push that other person away and make their emotions go away so that you feel better. And I have one of my podcasts, it's beautiful, with a lady named Tiffany who lost her husband 4 months prior, and they were both only 30 years old. But she goes, are you trying to make me feel better or yourself?
Right.
And that's the power of empathy and knowing what true empathy is. It's making a person feel heard, valued, and visible, and getting out of your own way and unlearning the things that you think, because we can't hear your intentions. So, yeah, when I talk about empathy training being an unlearning, inward self-reflection, self-care piece, that's what I'm talking about, because you cannot give from an empty cup. Empathy begins and ends with self-care, because if you're depleted and you're exhausted, you're not showing up for people. And if you're taking on their stuff, you're not showing up for people. And if somebody tells you something that makes you uncomfortable, or you need your own support and you're not doing that, then you can't show up for the next person as much as you want to. So you have to start with knowing what empathy is, why it's important, and quite often there's a very good business case for it, but then how to do it. And it starts with self-reflection and self-care, listening, and the very last step is talking.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like you have to be comfortable in your own mind with your own feelings, with the hard aspects of life before you can allow another person the space to experience them and actually be present for them.
Absolutely. But that doesn't mean you have to be at the end of your journey before you can be empathetic. You don't have to be okay with your own emotions. You don't have to do these things. You can still be on the journey to that. You can still be on that growth path, but acknowledging that everybody's on that journey. Nobody has it figured out. You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to be perfect. You have to let that person be imperfect while you're imperfect, and you're doing it together in a non-judgmental, supportive, safe, trusting environment. Because if you go, oh, dude, I have no clues what to say to that, but it's really important that you told me. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's figure it out. And we have lovely language tips that we use in our training, but let's figure it out. It's an invitation as opposed to, oh, you should talk to HR. Just have a drink. Just come out.
Yeah. It's a rejection. It's a kind of close down the path for connection because you're not able to hold it.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be there, but you need to know the consequences of making someone feel dismissed. And there's a stat that 70% of people, when they start talking about their mental health, feel dismissed. Like when they first tell someone they're struggling, they feel dismissed. And there's a horrifying statistic in Australia that 20% of people will experience a mental health issue in any year. Of those, roughly 50 to 60% don't seek treatment. And one of the key reasons people don't seek treatment is not knowing which of the people they live and work with are going to respond in a loving, safe way. That's not the 20% responsibility to fix. That's the 80%.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it a couple of times, and I'd like to take a deeper dive here on the importance of empathy. I guess to me, it seems obvious that without empathy, you just walk around and you don't understand the people around you and you can't live in that reality. So at the very basic level of just knowing how to engage with people, that seems important. But beyond that, what are some bigger effects that we need to consider?
How long have you got? So if we look at, let's say personally, we just talked about the 20%. So 20% struggling with their mental health, half don't seek treatment. If we look at that internally, you go, well, how do I feel when I'm dismissed? Do I change my behaviour? But also there was a piece of research that came out that talked about teenage suicide. And what they did was they talked to young people who had attempted to take their own life, but did not achieve that. And they said, why? And one of the top reasons they gave was not feeling heard. Now, that's not their responsibility to fix. That's ours. So personally, there are strengthening your relationships, lack of isolation, greater social bonds leads to better mental health. So there are personal benefits to it. In a business context, the benefits have been shown across the board. So apart from the fact that there's the top empathetic companies list, and the top ones make 50% greater profits than the ones on the bottom. There's statistics like 83% of people would consider leaving their employer for a more empathetic organisation. The reputation of your organisation is impacted by how empathetic your staff are and how empathetic your frontline staff are. There's a beautiful piece of research that talks about active empathetic listening from leaders and supervisors and managers, and how that leads to work engagement, which then leads to productivity, which then leads to well-being, which then leads to positive work measures. The trouble is a lot of people then look at just well-being and they put apples in the break room and do yoga on a Friday and do Are You OK Day. But they're too far down the path, because unless you have this culture of empathy where every single person feels heard, valued and visible, nobody cares what else you're doing. Nobody's going to engage with the apples in the break room or your, hey, we're having Wellness Wednesday, unless they genuinely believe it's coming from a place of being valued. If it's a tick box exercise, you can probably shove it. So Oh, look, there's so much in terms of a business case for this. When you then look at a customer service point of view, empathetic GPs and psychologists have better outcomes for their patients. I did a podcast yesterday on empathy and midwifery. Patients who have relational care based in empathy, which again is not jumping down the emotional rabbit hole, it's making someone feel heard, valued, and visible. They have better outcomes for the baby, the mum, the family, and society. This is shown across the board. So the empathy it has to be it has to be the way of the future. You look at people going to B Corps. Internal empathy is so very important. So you look at a lot of social enterprises and not-for-profits who are all focused on the beneficiary, but not internal empathy and not treating staff with kindness and consideration and value. And any organisation of the future, whether it's a B Corp or a small business or a social enterprise, if empathy is at your core, your staff will thrive. And when staff feel like you care about them, they care about your business. When customers feel seen, I did a podcast on empathy in sales. Every single podcast I've done comes back to relationships and self-care, whether it's paramedicine, emergency nursing, sales, midwifery, it doesn't matter. It always comes back to relationships and the ability to make people feel heard, valued, and visible, and take care of yourself and your own mental health in that process. That's how you get thriving businesses. That's how you get happy staff, low turnover, better mental health culture, better productivity, better brand reputation. And all of those things lead to a healthy bottom line. And it sounds so obvious because we can all think of the best boss we've ever had, and we can all think of the worst boss we've ever had.
Yep.
And they instantly come to mind, and you go, I don't want to be that guy. And what did I do? I left and I slagged off that company to everybody who I've ever met.
Right.
There are brands I wouldn't buy because I didn't like working there. And we talk about, if you get bad service from the bank teller, you don't say, Jenny wasn't very nice. You say, that bank sucks.
Yeah.
And you put it out there and you put it on social media. People don't go, Jenny at the bank was nice to me today. People go, yeah, no, the National Bank is horrible.
Right.
And that's the trouble, is everybody has these stories. So when it comes to a business case for this, if you've got staff who are representing your business, or managers or leaders or a board who are representing your organization and trying to achieve something, and they're not doing it in an empathetic, inclusive way, your reputation will precede you.
Right. And not in a good way. So you do, essentially, this is your focus now. You do empathy training of various types.
Yep.
And I guess the first question to ask is, can you train empathy, and what does this look like?
Absolutely. So at a really fundamental level, I can't tell you to be empathetic. I can't just say you should be empathetic, because people go, I don't know what that means. And no. So what we do is we actually have a really strong emotional activity at the beginning. And I get people in a very safe way to be vulnerable. I get them to tell the person next to them what that was. And they all, across the board, it doesn't matter if it's a little activity we do for corporates or if it's a big VR activity. Every single person across the board says, I just wanted to feel heard. And everybody goes, I just wanted to give them a pamphlet. And I go, can you not see how those two things don't connect? I just wanted to tell them it would all be okay. So a big part of empathy is empathetic language, how to speak in a way, because that's so important, to use language, use body language. You think about having a conversation with someone where they're constantly checking their phone.
Yeah.
So yes, that stuff can be trained, and it's a self-awareness and a self-reflection piece. And a lot of times that's where empathy comes from. It's getting rid of that judgment. In terms of me teaching you how to feel the feelings of other people, that's therapy. That's not empathy training. We learn that in therapy, and how to identify the emotions in other people. That's the emotional empathy piece. We don't overly focus on that. But the other thing is, of course, empathy can be trained in terms of let's say, cognitive empathy, but only if you have a foundation of compassionate empathy. If you have the foundation of knowing that people are to be heard, valued, and visible, and how to communicate that, then you can start to explore the realities and the experiences of other people, remembering that you will be making a lot of assumptions, but that's okay. And then you come into that beautiful design tool of persona and empathy mapping. And then once you get into and you go, oh, okay, so what might they be thinking and seeing and feeling and hearing? Oh, okay. Well, now we can use that, but we have to acknowledge that there's lots of assumptions in that. And we can then go and talk to people and listen and connect with people to validate that.
Mm.
But if you start with cognitive empathy, you'll be making lots of assumptions. You'll assume that it's right and you'll make lots of mistakes. So if you've got the foundation of compassionate empathy, so learning about yourself, learning about language, and you use that to learn more about cognitive and learn more about your users and your beneficiaries and your colleagues and yourself, and then you look deeper at the emotional piece, because that's where more vulnerability comes in. But it's about being open to listening to other people, because if they tell you they're feeling joy and you go, oh, that's weird. Oh, okay, why did I find that weird? Because the other thing that we can learn is something called an emotional egocentricity bias. And if you don't know it exists, you can't be aware of it. And what that is learning that we all make the assumption that other people's emotions are similar to ours. So if I'm feeling happy and you tell me you're feeling sad, I'm going to judge your sadness as less so than if I was sad as well. And if I'm in an angry mood, I'm going to assume based on my biases that you're angry as well.
Right. Interesting.
So we assume that other people's emotions are more similar to ours than we realize, which means that can also lead to dismissal, which can also lead to distance and disconnection. So yeah, that's another thing, like in our extended course, that we look at those biases, because what we assume other people are feeling quite often is not true. And we have to listen, be aware of our own biases, and truly listen to that person's experience and their emotions and acknowledge their emotions. So that's where connection is.
This reminds me of some language in NVC, in nonviolent communication. Is there some influence there? Have you looked into that?
Not directly. Everything that I've done has come straight from the workshops that I've done and the research on that, and more the active empathetic listening piece than the nonviolent communication piece. I was talking to somebody today about grief, and there's so much overlap.
Yeah. So in nonviolent communication, one thing that struck me is how they describe judgment. And judgment is considered a tragic, dysfunctional attempt to meet needs that are completely legitimate in themselves, right?
Yeah.
Like safety. And it's very interesting, the NVC communities, I feel like sometimes they might be taking it a little bit too far and making it part of everything they do. But there's definitely this really great principle of never assuming never state a fact about another person's experience, always phrase it as a question, always say something like, so what I'm hearing is, and then let the other person confirm.
Yeah. So a couple of things on that. The first one is when we look, let's say in the virtual reality space, in this psychosis space, learning that people quite often when they're struggling with psychosis are terrified. And in my virtual reality, I make people pretty scary and uncomfortable. But if you are looking at their behavior and you're thinking that they're angry, you're going to approach them in a very different way to if you think that they're terrified.
Right.
Your energy changes. Nothing about that person and their behavior changes, but your approach changes based on what you think they're coming at you with. And so when we train police officers, thinking that someone is being obstructive or difficult, and you're using language like deal with these people, you approach them in a very different way. If you think that you've got a human in front of you who's genuinely terrified of their own mind, then you act very differently. The other point to what you just said, there's a piece of research that talks about building trust, and acknowledging emotions will build greater trust than acknowledging the situation, even if you get the emotions wrong. So if somebody says to you, oh, Carol at work is making my life hell, and you say, oh, Carol's such a tool. as opposed to, wow, that sounds awful. How are you? Or that sounds really frustrating. Even if you get that emotion wrong and they say, actually, it's not that bad. Oh, some days are good. So, like whatever it is, but you will build greater trust by acknowledging an emotion, particularly a negative emotion, than you will by acknowledging the situation. And that in itself is an act of vulnerability on the listener's part, because you've got to be willing to get it wrong because you're heading for emotion, not fact.
Fascinating. You doing something that's called empathy commitment. And that kind of made me curious. What is that? What does it mean to make an empathy commitment? Tell me more about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we don't want at Empathy First is for people to do some training, go, oh, that was great, and disappear. Or have a team do a training and then just default back to what they were doing because they are not in an empathetic culture. So a lot of times you hear people say, oh, I want to do these things. I want to be empathetic, but my boss it's not that kind of environment. I mean, I remember I used to manage a team and I wanted to take them for coffees and listen to them, but my boss was putting such pressure on me that I didn't have that flexibility. I didn't have that. So I was passing that toxicity down the line. So what an empathy commitment is, we teach leaders what empathy is, and we talk about, well, what does it mean for your organization? We tell them, why is this valuable for your organization? And then how are you going to actually do this? What does this mean for you? We give them a template for an empathy commitment and they craft it for their organization so that you've got this beautiful top-down approach of everybody who interacts with business X will feel heard, valued, and visible. That is our goal. And everything that we do strives to achieve that. And somebody once said, what do you do for non-compliance? You know, like that whole policy non-compliance question. And so I put that in there and I said, anyone found not complying with our empathy commitment will be treated with love and respect and understanding to figure out what's going on and supported back to an empathetic culture. Because if you have your leaders in the organization, your board, your C-suite, genuinely saying, we care about our people, our customer, anyone who has an interaction with our business, then that's going to trickle down. And then you will get greater uptake for legislation training, mental health first aid, apples in the break room. But that has to be a top-down approach. It cannot be from the bottom up saying, we want to be heard. It has to be the board saying, we care about our people because we care about our business. And so what it is, it's solidifying that. And we didn't call it a policy because, I mean, you can if you want, but we didn't call it a policy. It's a commitment. And if people sign that and put it on the wall and say, we strive to put empathy first, because that is the absolute foundation of, like you said, it's the foundation of NVC. It's the foundation of mental health first aid. It's the foundation of all of the trainings and communication trainings and role playing and all that sort of stuff. If you're all speaking the same language to start with, and it's also where innovation and creativity are born, because it means that humans are allowed to flourish in a non-judgmental environment. That's where the good stuff happens. And we all know this. We all know how much effort we put in when our boss is a champion. We all know how we go and hide in the toilet when our boss is a bit of a dick.
Yeah.
Like, we've all done it. And if we can't extrapolate that and go, well, hang on, I can tell that one's productivity is better, and you can't penalize people or try and whack them back into submission. You have to, I guess, not aim for that well-being standard. Like, I want people to thrive. I want people to genuinely be interested in coming to work, in getting the best for our clients, our business, our mission. I don't want people to just not be If that is your goal in life, is just for people to be well, you're missing a huge opportunity for your business.
For sure. I have two final questions for you. The one before closing is, if people were curious about what they've heard, where can they find you? What products or services are you offering to dig deeper? Any kind of current projects that you want to talk about?
So if this has sparked curiosity in people, one of the things that you can do, so I'm Empathy First, empathykfirst.com.au. And I do training. So I have online training if you want to sit there and sit through online training. I have free online training on how to write emails with empathy. So you get to do a bit of a rewrite of a real email and go, ooh, I'm going to write that better. So you can do that for free. It takes about an hour. I've got the full empathy fundamentals workshop where I take you through what, why, how. And you do that by yourself online. I can run workshops for your team or for your leadership team, and we can do that in person if you're in Queensland or online Zoom. I mean, I'm going to be running some for the States next year that I'll be doing it at 1 a.m. I don't mind. We can do it that way, and it's very active. So lots of activities, lots of self-reflecting, lots of asking yourself questions. You can go onto the website and do an empathy quiz. So if you're genuinely curious, I'll give you a rating as to, based on your answers, where you sit in the empathy scale. Now, again, this is not emotional empathy. This is the compassionate empathy space. So it's got questions like, how good a listener are you? And lots of questions there. You can listen to the empathy podcast. So I do different professions and experiences. So empathy and grief, paramedicine. I'm about to release episode 27, which is midwifery. So empathy and midwives. So you can have a browse through there. We've done professional athlete, musical theatre, and the arts. What is the value of empathy, both from that profession and for that profession, so that we can really get in touch with how important this is in every sector? I am yet to do a podcast where people go, oh, look, being a dick is actually really good. Like even empathy in sales, where salespeople have this terrible reputation. Empathy in politics is a beautiful discussion about humanity.
Right.
So have a browse through there. But yeah, there's lots of different ways. So you can go to empathyfirst.com.au. You can follow me on Instagram, that's the one, or LinkedIn. So Empathy First HQ is where I am on Instagram. Find me, Leanne Butterworth, on LinkedIn. I love chatting to people on LinkedIn and I put all sorts of stuff on there. But it's about opening not only your mind, but opening your heart. Mine says intellectual. I say open your heart and really learn to listen to humans as humans to be heard, not problems to be solved.
Yeah.
But that's where I am. I'm everywhere.
And so our closing question is always the same. I mentioned Alain de Botton's TED Talk, where he talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon, where a lecture is kind of the modern secular version where you're just trying to give someone a little bit of information and then they can make up their own mind. And a sermon is a more urgent, more passionate plea trying to change someone's life. And so I'm going to give you a little stage for a short sermon. For someone who is convinced that empathy is important, what is the one lesson that can really change their life and their experience?
So the thing that I would say to people is be really ready to self-reflect and to open your life and to strengthen your relationships and take that burden off you of having to have the right answer. So to me, empathy is really freeing. It is opening your heart, opening your mind, releasing yourself of the burden of having to have the right answers and taking on emotional baggage. So if you're ready for that journey, then looking at it in a way that is safe and looking at a way that is memorable and innovative. And when the chips are down and you are face to face with someone and you're thinking, oh crap, I have to be empathetic and I've forgotten everything that I've learned, is having the skills and the tools that we teach you so that in that moment of fight or flight, you nail it, you get it right. And you make that person feel heard, valued, and visible in a way that respects your own boundaries and your own integrity and your own humanity and respects the humanity and integrity of the other person as well. So really being open-minded, open-hearted to learning new ways of thinking, but new ways of thinking and practical, memorable, easy to grab skills that help you in that moment when you absolutely need it and could be life-changing for the other person.
Yeah. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you very much.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.